benevolence is defined as the disposition to do good. It's the inclination to engage in kind or charitable acts. And while the benevolent acts that lead us to promote the prosperity and happiness of others can make us feel all warm and fuzzy inside, every Christian must begin to grasp that the real beauty of benevolence has less to do with the fuzzy feelings that we experience, and it has more to do with the opportunity to reflect the omnibenevolent nature of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And while the main function of benevolence is based on the act of feeding people and caring for the needs of the poor, the main purpose of benevolence is actually to draw people to God through the social expression of Christian charity. Here in our study today, we're going to consider the beauty of benevolence. And as we continue our study of 1 Samuel chapter 30, David is actually going to help us to see, number one, that benevolence is beautiful because it becomes help for the helpless. We're also going to see that benevolence is beautiful because it provides for the powerless. And finally, today we'll consider how benevolence is beautiful because it brings hope to the hopeless. Well, with this as our outline, let's open our Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 30, because there we find David demonstrating the beauty of benevolence by helping the helpless. As you turn to 1 Samuel chapter 30, I want to set the stage for our study today, and it'll help us to remember that there was an attack that occurred in the city of Ziklag, and this was the place where David and his friends and family members were living. In our text last week, we learned that the Amalekites, they attacked Ziklag, and after David left his home, and after his men followed him off to the Philistine battle line, that's when the Amalekites came in and attacked their families and took their wives and children captive. And it's with this background in mind that I want to continue our exposition of 1 Samuel chapter 30. I want to begin reading there at verse 9, because there we learn that David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Besor. Then they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate. And they let him drink water. And they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. I want to stop right there and consider how here in these verses we find David and we find his 600 mighty men. They're pursuing those Amalekites. They're pursuing their enemies so that they could go and save their families from the Amalekite captors. And as they arrived at the brook Besor, they took a moment, they took a little break there, and they began to rehydrate with some much-needed water. And while this brook wasn't a great distance from Ziklag, we must remember that these men, they had just returned from a 3-day journey from the Philistine battle lines, which means that these guys were probably pretty tired. They had carried all of their equipment, and they had probably made this 3-day journey with the hopes of getting home and getting something to eat, probably thinking that their wives would be there with food ready to go. And so they're probably very hungry and very thirsty and very tired. As a result, there was a third of David's men who decided that they were unable to keep up with the rest of the group, and so they decided to stay there at this brook. Notice again there at verse 10. There we learn that David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary that they could not cross the brook Besor. Now here in this verse, we learn that David was pursuing the Amalekites, and it'll help us to understand that the word pursued there, it's found in verse 10, and it comes from a Hebrew word which refers to a person who is chasing after another by running as fast as they can. So these guys weren't like hiking and just having a nice stroll in order to catch up with the Amalekites. No, they were trucking. They were running as fast as they could to catch up with the Amalekites. And from this, I'm guessing that David's pace was just too fast for 200 of these men. And so rather than slowing down the group, rather than telling everybody, hey, wait for us, they said, you know what, we're just going to stay here. We're going to camp out here at this brook, and they're going to allow the rest of these men to continue. As a result, the 400 men who were able to keep up, they were able to move even more quickly now because they were able to shed their gear. They're able to take off all the gear and leave it with these 200 men so that they could just take off running even faster. And so the 400 men took off with David and pursued the Amalekites. As they continued their pursuit, it wasn't long until they found a helpless man in the middle of a field. Notice again there in verse 11. There we learn that they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate, and they let him drink water. As we consider this helpless man who was found in this field, it would have been real easy for David and his men to just pass him by without giving him much thought at all. I mean, they could have been just running, chasing the Amalekites. They see a helpless, starving man there in the field, and they could have said, well, bummer for him, but we've got business to take care of. No, they didn't do that. David and his men decided to stop and provide benevolent aid to this starving Egyptian. As a matter of fact, look with me again there, 1 Samuel chapter 30. I want to begin reading at verse 12. There we learn that they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. So when he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. Now here in this verse we find David and his men, they're revealing the beauty of benevolence as they provided help for this helpless man. And while they could have allowed this man to starve to death out there in the field, they didn't. Instead, they nursed him back to health by sharing their food and their water with this helpless man. In so doing, they're helping us to see here the beauty of benevolence. And not only that, but their act of benevolence, it also provided them with a valuable ally. Now, with this in mind, look back at our text. I want to begin reading at verse 13. There we learn that David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" And he said, "I am a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite. And my master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick. We made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites, in the territory which belongs to Judah, and of the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." David said to him, "Can you take me down to this troop?" So he said, "Swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this troop." And when he had brought him down, there they were, spread out over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. Then David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives, and nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. Now here in these verses we learn that David's benevolence towards this Egyptian had paid off. Because, you see, this wasn't some random starving Egyptian that you would oftentimes find out in these open fields back then. No, I'm joking, you wouldn't just normally come across starving Egyptians. But, this wasn't just some random guy. This wasn't just some guy that just happened to be out there in this field. No, he was actually a servant of one of the Amalekite leaders, the Amalekites, who had just robbed David's family. Well, according to his own testimony, this Egyptian had become ill, and that's when his Amalekite master decided to leave him behind just to die. Now, there's no benevolence in that at all. You're sick? Well, you're slowing us down. We're going to leave you here to die. Clearly, there was no benevolence in the heart of this Amalekite master, and yet here was David and his men nursing him back to health. And then after receiving the benevolent help of David and his men, this Egyptian servant, he was willing and able to lead David and his men to the camp of his former master. Upon their arrival, David and his men, they attacked the Amalekites. And we learned that they attacked them over the course of 24 hours, from twilight until the evening of the next day. And thanks to the help of this starving servant, David was able to recover everything that the Amalekites had taken from them, including their wives, their sons, and all of their daughters. Now, from this, we see how a beautiful act of benevolence provided David and his men the intel that they needed to overtake their enemy and rescue their family from the wicked intentions of the Amalekites. And while it's true that those who choose to help the helpless will oftentimes benefit from their own acts of benevolence, I want to point out that true benevolence isn't really focused on what we might receive in return. And that's certainly not what these guys were thinking. They weren't thinking, well, here's this starving Egyptian, let's nurse him back to health to see what we can get out of him. No, I think that they just helped this guy because he was helpless. But as a result, they were blessed by the information that he had. But true benevolence is simply based on a desire to help the helpless, and for no other reason than because they need help. Now, in order to further explain my point, if you would, hold your place there at 1 Samuel and turn with me to Luke chapter 10. As you turn to Luke 10, we should take a moment to consider some of the various drivers for benevolent giving. For some people, the benevolence of a charitable gift, it's fueled by the desire to receive certain tax breaks at tax time. Rather than helping the helpless because it's the right thing to do, these people help the helpless because it's a good way to receive tax deductions at the end of the year. And while some people are interested in tax deductions, others are more interested in appearances. In other words, these people are more concerned about how they are viewed in the eyes of their community. They want to be seen as a philanthropist. They want to be seen as someone who gives charitably. Kind of like when you go to one of the stores that then asks you, do you want to give $1 towards this charity? How many times have you given that dollar simply because you don't want the person next to you to think that you're stingy, or that you don't care about breast cancer, or that you don't care about diabetes? Well, I'll give the $1, but just because I don't want this person to think ill of me. No, that's not the right reason to give. There are those who engage in benevolent acts because they're hoping for some good karma, so to speak. In other words, they're not really concerned about the person that they're helping. They just want some good karma to come back to them. And so they do something nice in the hopes that something nice will happen for them when they find themselves in a helpless situation. As we consider all these reasons for engaging in acts of benevolence, we must understand that they all fall short, extremely short, of what true Christian benevolence is. Because listen, true Christian benevolence, it will lead us to help the helpless simply because the love and charity of Jesus Christ compels us to help them. It's because the Lord moves in our heart in such a way that we're compelled by the love of God to help those who are truly helpless. And with this in mind, we should consider the story of the Good Samaritan, which is found here in Luke chapter 10. If you would look with me beginning at verse 30, there Jesus told a story about a certain man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he sat him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Now here in these verses, Jesus tells this classic story about a Samaritan man who found a man who was badly beaten by a band of robbers. Rather than passing him by like the religious priest and the Levite had done, this Samaritan actually stopped and helped this helpless man. Well, not only was Jesus presenting us with a contrast between the Samaritan and those religious men who refused to help him, he's also presenting us with a contrast between the Samaritan and the innkeeper. Now, that's something that we don't always consider here. But let's just take a moment to consider this contrast between the Samaritan and the innkeeper, because both of these men helped the helpless man. But you see, the innkeeper, well, he wasn't commended in Jesus' story. He wasn't honored in Jesus' story, but instead, the Samaritan was commended, because the Samaritan was the one who revealed the true beauty of benevolence. The reason why is this, is because the Samaritan helped this helpless man who, after being robbed, had no ability to pay him back. He had nothing to pay this man back with. But the innkeeper, he helped the helpless man simply because the Samaritan was willing to come back and pay him for whatever he ended up using. And so it's not the innkeeper who helped this helpless man who was commended, because the innkeeper was going to be paid for it. He was going to receive back whatever he paid. But it was the Samaritan who was honored in this story simply because he was willing to help the helpless for no other reason than because the man needed help. From this example presented in this parable, we too should become believers who reveal the beauty of benevolence by helping those who are unable to help themselves. That's why Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." We ought to be those, not like the religious people who passed them by because they had all their reasons to not help, not like the innkeeper who was willing to do something so long as he got something in the end, but like the Samaritan who just helped because the man was helpless and because the love of God compelled him to help. Well, while it's true that the beauty of benevolence can clearly be seen whenever we choose to help the helpless, the beauty of benevolence can also be seen whenever we begin to provide for the powerless. Now, with this in mind, let's turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 30, because there we find David providing for the powerless. If you would, let's begin reading there at verse 20. There we learn that David took all the flocks and herds that they had driven before those other livestock and said, "This is David's spoil." Now David came to the 200 men who had been so weary that they could not follow David, whom they also had made to stay at the brook Besor. So they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David answered and said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart." But David said, "My brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered us into our hand, the troop that came against us. For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part is who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike." So it was, from that day forward, he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. Now here in these verses we find David not only recovering what was taken from their homes in Ziklag, but he also claimed possession of all the spoil that the Amalekites had left behind. Remember, they had invaded all sorts of places, including the southern end of Judah. And so David claimed all of this spoil for himself, and it'll help us to understand that the word spoil, it comes from a Hebrew word which refers to the possessions that a soldier acquires after defeating an enemy in battle. And so after David and his men defeated the Amalekites, the Hebrew victors claimed the possessions of their enemy for their own. And while there was no question that the spoil of these Amalekites belonged to the victors of this battle, the victorious Israelites, well, they didn't really want to share the spoil with those men who had stayed behind. With this in mind, notice again there at verse 22. There we learn that all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David, it's not calling the men who stayed behind wicked and worthless. He's saying all the wicked and worthless men who went with me and fought this battle. And here's what they say there in verse 22. "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except for every man's wife and children, that they may lead them away and depart." Now here in this verse, we find the 400 men who were able to go up against the Amalekites. They're making their case against the 200 men who were too weak to move beyond the brook Besor. And according to these men, the 200 men who had no power to move forward, the ones who had no power to fight this fight, they should not only be excluded from receiving a portion of the spoil, but they should just take their family and leave Ziklag altogether. They just wanted them to go away. Thankfully for those men, David wasn't of the same mindset. David was a benevolent leader who understood the value of providing for the powerless. And here in our text, he demonstrates the beauty of benevolence by doing just that. Now, with this in mind, look with me there at verse 23. There David says, "My brethren, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us." Now, as we consider the beginning of David's argument here, we must understand that according to David, the Lord was the one who had given them the power to defeat the Amalekites. Therefore, these possessions that they had acquired through their victory, it wasn't something that they had somehow, conjured up the power to go and defeat this enemy and claim this spoil. No. This was a gift from God. It was a benevolent gift from God. God said, here, I'm going to give you the power to win this battle, and I'm going to give you the power to claim the spoil for your own. And so all of this, it was just a benevolent gift from God. And since they were the recipients of God's benevolence, then wasn't it also their job to share in God's benevolent gifts? Well, that's what David thought. David was saying, look, this spoil that we've gained here, it's a benevolent gift from God. So should we not share it then? Should we not be benevolent with the benevolence that we've received? Well, then after reminding these men that they were the recipients of God's benevolence, David went on to remind them about that the 200 men who were unable to fight, they had no power to move forward, they still served a purpose. With this in mind, look with me there at verse 24. There David asked, "For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part is who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall share alike." Now, here in the second part of David's argument, David was reminding the 400 that the 200 men who had no power to move forward, the 200 men who had no power to fight, they were the same men who stayed behind to protect the gear of those who fought. You see, if all these men had been forced to carry their own gear until they found the Amalekites, then chances are they would have all been too exhausted to fight and win this battle. So the very fact that these 200 men were willing to stay behind and guard the gear so that the 400 could take off their heavy equipment and move faster, well, it gave them, or it empowered them to be able to have the energy to fight when they found the Amalekites. And so everybody served their purpose. The 400 who fought, they served their purpose. The 200 who stayed behind, they served their purpose as well. And so from David's point of view, God's people, he's saying God's people should reveal the beauty of benevolence by providing for those, even those who are too powerless to go the distance like others. I should point out that David felt so strongly about this that he ended up passing laws in Israel so that the powerless would be provided for according to the benevolent plan of God. With this in mind, notice again there at verse 25. There we learn that from that day forward, he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. In other words, David passed laws which would ensure that those who were powerless would still be provided for. And from this example, we should take a moment to consider how the beauty of benevolence is revealed when the people of God go out of their way to provide for those who don't have the power to provide for themselves. And so with this as our focus, if you would hold your place there in the book of 1 Samuel, turn with me to 1 John chapter 3. As you turn to 1 John chapter 3, I want to take a moment to define what I mean by powerless. Because there are those who ask for our benevolence by claiming to be powerless, and yet all they're really doing is looking for a free ride so that they can avoid the responsibility of working and making a living for themselves. For example, there are those who they show up to church on Sunday, and they typically show up right after the service is ending. And they'll start sharing their sad story with any person who will stop and listen. And the whole time, all they're hoping for is that someone's going to reach into their wallet, someone's going to reach into their purse and pull out some cash and give it to them so that they can leave. Reminds me of a man who stopped by the church just a few weeks ago. He came to the church right after first service. He came in asking for some money because his truck had supposedly run out of gas. According to him, he needed to move his truck immediately before it was towed from that parking lot that it was parked in. Well, I asked him, where is it parked? He said, well, it's in this apartment complex. I said, don't worry, they're not going to tow it in the next hour. So don't sweat it, Hang out during second service, enjoy the Bible study, and after second service, I'll meet with you, and I'm not going to give you any cash, but we can go get some gas and get it in your tank. And we'll get you on the road. So don't worry. Hang out, chill out, enjoy the study, and we'll take care of your problem right after second service. Well, as soon as I was done talking with him, he turned around and walked right out the door. He left. You see, he didn't want to hang out for a Bible study. He just wanted some cash in hand so that he could go do what he wanted to do. Well, he thought he'd probably never see me again, but it was the next day. I was having breakfast at Central Market, And that guy walks into the dining area there at Central Market, and he walks up to some people sitting at a table right next to me. He didn't even see me. I'm thinking, how can you not see me, you know? But he didn't. He didn't see me. And he walks over to the people at this table next to me, and he starts feeding them the same sad story that he gave me here at church. And in the middle of his story, and this is an elderly lady and some friend of hers, and he's just totally lying to these people. Halfway through his story, he looks up and makes eye contact with me, and I'm just sitting there just staring him down. And, you know, I really wanted to jump in, but I was going to allow these ladies to make up their own decision, and they gave him some money, and he went out the door and then went back in the next door over and headed straight back to the alcohol area of the store. So he didn't need gas. He needed alcohol. And he was using people and scamming people because he doesn't want to go work at a job and make a paycheck and pay for his own alcoholism. Christian, listen, if you see anybody come to this church asking for money, just send them straight to me. Because I would love to talk with them about their needs. And it's not that we don't want to provide for those who are in need. We just want to make sure it's a true need and that the people of this church aren't being scammed by the scammers who are just preying on Christian benevolence. And while we should be people who are ready to provide for those who are unable to provide for themselves, we must remember that the Lord hasn't called us to pay the way for those who choose to not work. There are those who can't work, and certainly they should be provided for. But there are those who simply choose not to work, and this is what Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 3. He says, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. That's what Paul says. And so if you choose not to work, then you're also going to choose to be hungry. It's not our job to provide for those who simply refuse to work. Now, it's true that there are many scammers out there, and I'm telling you, there are many scammers. Most of them are standing on a street corner with a funny sign. Be careful. Don't supply their alcohol simply because you all of a sudden had this caring heart to give them something. Be careful, because they're scamming you. They're attempting to abuse our call to become benevolent believers. And yet at the same time, there are those who truly are powerless. They're powerless to provide for themselves, like orphans. Orphans are powerless to provide for themselves. There's elderly widows out there who have no family left, and they're powerless to provide for themselves. There are people with all sorts of conditions who are powerless to provide for themselves. And as we consider these powerless people, I want to consider what John wrote here in his first epistle. If you would look with me there at 1 John 3, verse 16. John says, by this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Now, here in these verses, the Apostle John helps us to see that the Christian can talk all day long about Christian love. But true Christian love should always lead us to engage in the sort of good works which would cause us to take the goods that God has given to us, the benevolent goods that God has given to us, and share it with those who cannot provide for themselves. If God has given you the benevolence of a sharp mind and an ability to work, and he's given you a job so that you can make money, listen, all of that money isn't for you. You might think that it is, but according to God, it's not. If God is giving you a nice paycheck because he supplied you with the ability to work, all of that money does not belong to you. A lot of it belongs to our government. But within our government system, they've set up benevolent help for those who are in need. And not only that, but there's a portion of that that belongs to God for furthering his work and the benevolence that we want to produce here at this church. And so you can't just look at your paycheck and say, oh, this is mine. I'm going to do whatever I want with it. No, if God has given you benevolence through the ability to work and make money, you have to turn around and say, like David, well, shouldn't I share this spoil with others around me? Listen, Paul encouraged the Hebrew believers also of the first century. In Hebrews 13:16, he says that we should not forget to do good and to share. For with such sacrifices, God is well pleased. Christians should be a sharing people. And from this, we must understand that God is calling us to demonstrate his love by taking the provisions that he's given us and share it with those who cannot provide for themselves. And while it's true that God could just provide for those people in supernatural ways, I mean, God could just make $1 million appear in the bank account of a person that can't provide for themselves. It's not the way he wants to go about it, typically. Usually, he wants to move in the heart of a believer to share, because in so doing, the believer grows in Christian maturity as the powerless person is provided for. And so, it's a win-win situation. God has chosen to use us to reveal the beauty of his benevolent nature by sharing our resources with those who are powerless to provide for themselves. And so we see then that the beauty of benevolence is revealed whenever we help the helpless. We also reveal the beauty of benevolence when we provide for the powerless. And finally, though, we should consider how we reveal the beauty of benevolence when we bring hope to the hopeless. And with this in mind, let's turn back to 1 Samuel chapter 30, because there we find David bringing hope to the hopeless. If you would, look with me there at verse 26. There we learn that David came to Ziklag, and he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." To those who were in Bethel, those who were in Ramoth of the south, those who were in Jatir, those who were in Aroer, those who were in Siphmoth, those who were in Eshtemoa, those who were in Rachel, those who were in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, those who were in the city of the Kenites, those who were in Hormah, those who were in Koreshan, those who were in Atak, those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to rove. Now, here in these verses, we find David, and he's actually taking a portion of the spoil, and he's dividing it up amongst the elders of Judah. And we see that this benevolent gift from David was sent out to the various cities there in the southern area of Israel, and as well, he sent it to every other place that David and his men would shelter from King Saul. So while David was on the run, I'm sure that they were out using resources and receiving benevolence from some of these people, and so David was paying it back, so to speak. David was providing hope also for the hopeless of this area. Now, in order to explain what I mean by the hopeless of this area, I want to take a moment to consider the sense of hopelessness that these Israelites were probably feeling. I should first point out that the Israelites here in these cities of Judah, they were constantly being raided by the enemies of Israel. As a matter of fact, notice again there at verse 14. There in verse 14, we learn that the Egyptian servant told David that we made an invasion of the southern area of the Cherethites in the territory which belonged to Judah, and of the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. Now, here we see that the Amalekites not only invaded the land of the Philistines, but they were also invading the southern area of Judah. And so I would imagine that these Israelites, they were constantly being robbed by their enemies. I should remind you that the Lord had commanded Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And the reason why is because God knew that these Amalekites were going to continue to trouble the Israelites. Unfortunately, Saul had failed to complete this mission, and as a result, the Israelites in the southern area of Judah, they were constantly being attacked, invaded, and robbed. Now just imagine for a moment. Some of you may have been robbed before, come home and found your house has been broken into and stuff stolen. You know the hopelessness of that. The feeling that, man, I'm not safe here. And everything that I just worked so hard for was just taken in a moment. There's a sense of hopelessness in that. But now imagine living in an area where you have enemies that are constantly coming in and robbing and stealing and taking and kidnapping. Imagine living in an area like that and living in an area with a king who really doesn't have your back. A king who's never going to come in and bring in retribution, and he's never going to restore what has been taken from you. This is exactly the situation that the Israelites found themselves in. Complete hopelessness. And with that being the case, it's probably safe to assume that these families in Judah, they were broke and they were living without any hope. And while Saul didn't seem to be interested in helping the Israelites with any sort of benevolent assistance, David was clearly a man who understood the beauty of benevolence. And with a desire to bring hope to these hopeless Israelites, David sent benevolent gifts to the cities of Judah. With this example in mind, as we consider David's example here, we should consider the importance of using benevolence to bring hope to the hopeless. And so if you would, let's turn to James chapter 2. Now, as you turn to James 2, I should point out that the world is filled with people who have no hope at all. You see, the world system in which we live has convinced us that the pursuit of wealth is the path to true happiness. As a result, there are people out there who are falling into all sorts of financial scams, which not only fails to provide them with promised riches, but it also robs them of the money that they used to buy into the scam they invested in, all sorts of pyramid schemes and whatnot. I remember as a kid, my stepmother, spent all of her money on Mary Kay products. And then when she couldn't move it, she just sat there with all this makeup, all this product. She couldn't find enough people to move it for her because that's part of the scam. And so she lost all of her money, and she had all this worthless Mary Kay product stuff. It didn't help her at all. It actually led us into further financial troubles. So there are those who buy into these pyramid schemes, and they think, if I can just buy into this scheme, I'll take what little money I have left and buy this product and then try to move it amongst my friends and all this kind of stuff. Be careful. Be careful before you fall into these scams. Many times people are left hopeless and hopelessly broke. Then there are those of us who were promised a pot of gold by traveling on the rainbow road of higher learning. We're told, just go to college and get your degree, and as soon as you get out, man, there's going to be an awesome job waiting for you. I don't know how many times I've met a waiter or a waitress who is attempting to pay off their school loans because they finally graduated only to find out that there's a major unemployment problem going on right now. And so there they are, working for less than minimum wage and hoping for tips, because they're trying to pay off student loans that are no good to them anymore because they can't get a job in the business that they went to school for. Unemployment has left many Americans feeling hopeless, feeling like there's no way out, that the bills are greater than the income, and that there's nothing to hope in anymore. Without a doubt, there are many troubling stories of people who are broke and have no hope. And listen, God's going to bring these people across our path. We're going to meet these people at work. We're going to meet these people at the store. We're going to meet these people at church. And as God brings these people across our path, we should pray about our responsibility in bringing hope to the hopeless. Now, with this in mind, if you would, look with me there at James chapter 2. I want to begin at verse 14. There James asks, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, foolish man, that faith without works is dead?'" Now, hearing these verses, James presents us with a tough question about the evidence of our faith. Without a doubt, this is highly controversial text here, and the cults will often use this text to say, you see, you got to have faith plus works in order to get saved. But that's not what James is talking about here. You see, the context of James has everything to do with our justification before men. In other words, if you go and tell someone that you have faith in God, but your works don't demonstrate that faith, then you have a dead faith. In other words, it's a faith that it doesn't prove anything to them. So you can talk all day long about being a Christian, but if you are not living like a Christian, then your talk about faith is worthless. That's what James is saying. But he's not saying that faith plus works will get you saved. No, that's not what James is saying at all. James is actually asking us about the kind of faith that leads us to good works. In other words, if you truly have faith in God, if you truly believe in Jesus Christ, if you've truly received the forgiveness of sins, if you've truly received the grace of God by faith in Jesus Christ, then shouldn't that be a faith that leads you into a life of good works? Of course it is. And so the person who says that they have faith, but then their life never changes, and they never begin to live in a way that reflects the benevolence of our God, do they really have faith? Probably not. Probably not. Because true faith will lead us into a life of good works. You see, anyone can say that they have faith. It's an easy claim to make. I can tell you that I used to play pro ball for the NBA. I can jam a ball. But I'd be lying. But I can say it. I can say it all day long, but it doesn't prove anything. Anyone can say that they're a Christian. Anyone can say that they have faith. But the person who has true saving faith in Jesus Christ will be moved by the charity of the Lord to demonstrate their faith by good works. And listen, one of the best ways to demonstrate our faith in Jesus is by revealing the beauty of our Savior's benevolence. What this means is that the true Christian will begin to care less about how much they can acquire for themselves, and we'll begin to care more about how we can take what God has given us and use it to bring hope to the hopeless. Now, as we consider the beauty of benevolence here, I should remind you that Jesus is the perfect picture of God's omnibenevolent nature. God is omnibenevolent. He has charity for everyone. He wants to shower his benevolence on every single person. And with this example in mind, we should spend some time asking the Lord to help us to understand how we can better reflect his benevolence. How can we become believers who better reflect his benevolent nature? And as we consider how we might become believers who better reflect the benevolence of our Lord, I want to point out that benevolence without evangelism falls short of the Lord's example. You see, there is something called the social gospel, and it is very popular within the church today. There are many churches who want to provide water for those who have no water, and they want to go dig wells. They want to go and provide food for the people who are starving. They want to provide clothes for those who are naked. And they want to do all these benevolent works. But they want to do it without presenting the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I'm here to tell you that what's the point? What's the point in that? You see, God wants to shower us with his benevolence, but it's a benevolence that comes with a message. And that message is that the benevolence of God is found in Jesus Christ. And so if we go into the world and we make sure that everyone is clothed and fed and fully hydrated, and then they die and go to hell, what did we actually do? Nothing. We did nothing. We kept someone fat and happy here on earth, but they're going to spend the rest of eternity in hell. And so what was the point of the benevolence? Benevolence without evangelism is a powerless social gospel. And it makes someone feel good for a time and a season, but it does nothing for the saving of their soul. And so we should be Christians who are benevolent, always remembering that with that benevolence should come the message of Jesus Christ and his cross and the ultimate everlasting gift of benevolence that's found in the heart of the person who receives the grace of Jesus Christ. Without debate, the Lord is calling us to reflect his benevolent nature. He's calling us to help others to see the omnibenevolence of a God who loves us with an infinite love. And so with that, I would encourage you, with the gospel of Jesus Christ on your lips, let's go out and help the helpless. Let's go out and provide for the powerless. And let's bring hope to the hopeless. But let's always remember that we demonstrate the beauty of benevolence when we point people to the grace of God which is found in Jesus Christ.